They set me up. They fired me. And that VGTMs, how they ked themselves into a divorce, a prison, and that's how they ended up with divorces, jail time, and a bunch of deportations. This story's long, but if you stick around till the end, you'll see how I got framed and fired from my job, accidentally starting a chain reaction that overhauled the staff. Several managers got the boot or were moved to other spots. The head manager got fired and divorced. One manager got investigated by the FBI and arrested, and a bunch of workers got deported. Here we go. I used to work at this fancy restaurant owned by a big corporate group with several restaurant brands. I worked there for about 3.5 years before they finally fired me, but more on that later. First, let me tell you about my role there. I did a bit of everything at that job. From the day I started, I was determined to learn as much as possible. I bugged management constantly to learn new departments. I began as a server, but eventually worked my way through various roles like carry-out, hosting, bartending, barbacking, banquets, catering, and deliveries. My main goal was to be available for as many hours as possible. They paid me around $12 an hour, though it varied if I was bartending or serving and making tips. Eventually, management noticed I was best suited for one of the non-tipped positions. I was so good at it that they made me an unofficial supervisor over the team working in carry-out, catering, and deliveries. This meant fewer hours since I was now focused on one department, so I negotiated a $1.50 pay increase due to added responsibilities. They agreed. I wasn't trying to get rich. I just wanted to pay my bills and have a little money left for fun. Living in highly taxed Chicago, Illinois made it tough to make ends meet. I'm a simple guy who enjoys long-term hobbies. A video game could keep me entertained for months, sometimes years. I had a pet I brought to Chicago, which was an extra expense. Shortly after becoming the unofficial supervisor, I got a girlfriend and started spending more money on her. With my position and careful budgeting, I managed to afford it all. Money wasn't the problem, but the high turnover rate in management meant new managers often didn't understand our department or how crucial hours were for the workers. Eventually, it was clear our current general manager was getting replaced. The new guy, who we'll call Hank, was supposed to be some hotshot at improving restaurants. We Googled him and found his mugshot for repeated domestic abuse. This is important later. Right after Hank started making changes, one of our best managers quit. She refused to work with him and warned us to expect lots of harassment and that he VJTMD run the place into the ground. Not long after she left, Hank started replacing our current managers with his own people. Eventually, only one manager remained, the kitchen manager, who we'll call Chuck. Chuck had been there since I started and adapted his values to match whoever was in charge. I saw him as a suck-up and a traitor. Hank never replaced the manager for our department, so it ran without much oversight, except for me as the supervisor. We didn't limit have someone breathing down our necks constantly. Our department had some hiccups, but ran smoothly overall. We often had to radio for a manager to come help with approvals, and Chuck was usually the one to answer since the kitchen was closest. Over time, the new managers started seeing Chuck as our department manager. However, the hourly team still saw me as their supervisor. This meant whenever Chuck tried to make harmful changes, the team relied on me to fix things or negotiate with Chuck. Over several months, Chuck and I clashed repeatedly. He thought we should live off tips like servers, but most of our orders were carry-out through apps like Grubhub, which didn't VDJTMTT tip. We didn't VDJTMT have many deliveries, and the few tips we got were split among the team, which wasn't much. It showed Chuck had no idea what he was talking about. Eventually, we had a meeting with Hank, Chuck, and all the department workers. It was a chance to air grievances without fear of retaliation. The team spoke out about Chuck trying to cut hours even though he wasn't VDJTMT'd our actual manager. When they mentioned hiring someone to manage us, the team suggested I take over since I had been supervising and running things smoothly for months. I also helped management with schedules, understanding when workers could or couldn't VDJTMT work due to school or family. I saw Hank and Chuck exchange a look, and I knew then that my days were numbered. They made a bunch of promises about not cutting hours and keeping at least 2 people for closing. They said we VJTM'd work the hours we were scheduled. But only about a week later, they started sending everyone home early again. One night, Chuck tried to send everyone except me home after a big catering event with tons of cleanup left. I confronted him about breaking his promise. He told me to stop complaining and threatened to find someone else for my shift. I realized he wanted to push me out, so I backed off and started cleaning. I had to stay late, which meant overtime pay. I got a write-up for it since we needed a manager VJTM's approval for overtime. I refused to sign it, explaining the situation, and was allowed to leave without signing because the HR rep wasn't VJTM'd, one of Hank VJTM's cronies. Now, let VJTM's move to the day I got fired. I always came to work an hour early since food in Chicago was expensive, and we could have free soup and bread at work. On this day, a line cook told me a dish had been canceled after cooking, and Chuck had said to give it to someone. He assured me it was comped and free to take. It was my favorite appetizer, so I took it happily. Soon after, Hank and Chuck approached me, asking if I had put in a ticket for the food. I told them the line cook had given it to me as a canceled order Chuck had comped. Chuck acted clueless. Hank said, "I think you know that's theft. Finish the food, then grab your stuff and go. That's the last meal you'll have here." I tried explaining, but they refused to listen. By the time we went to the kitchen to talk to the line cook, he had gone home. I had no choice but to gather my stuff, say my goodbyes, and leave. I told my team what happened. They were shocked and angry, but mostly sad to see me go. I decided to stop by the accounting office to pick up any tips that week. I had a gut feeling to set my phone to record, and I stuffed it into my pocket. The video was black, but I managed to record Hank and Chuck discussing how they had planned my firing since the department meeting. I knocked, and they hushed up before opening the door. They asked why I was still there, and I asked for my tips. They gave them to me. Despite my anger, I didn't burn the bridge, thinking I might need to nuke it later. I offered a handshake, thanked them for the opportunity, and left, making sure to record the restaurant's front with the name and logo. Working in a restaurant teaches you to cover your own ass. If I was accused of theft, I wanted to prove it was NVDJTM true if it came up in future job interviews. That VDJTM's where things started going nuclear. On the train ride home, I sent messages and posted in local Facebook groups saying I was fired and needed a job fast. By the time I got off at my stop, I had an interview set up for later that day. I was offered the job about 5 minutes into the interview, but after going over the details, it didn't seem like a good fit for me, so I turned it down. I went to a few more interviews and finally found one that was perfect, better pay and no dealing with customers. It was an auditing job for a logistics company. During the interview with the new manager, Bob, he mentioned he had already called my previous workplace and spoken with the head manager, Hank. Hank had told him I got fired for theft. Luckily, Bob asked me to explain, and he let me pull out my phone to find the recording. I asked if the voice he spoke to was the same as the one in the recording. It was. That was all the confirmation he needed to know I didn't make it up. He listened to the two managers admitting they set me up and watched until the end, where I showed the front of the restaurant with its name and logo. Bob hired me on the spot and asked me to send him the recording. I did. I thought that was the end of it. About 7 months later, after getting settled in the job, HR sent out a welcome to our new team members email listing the new hires, some facts about them, and their pictures. They sent these out every time they hired a new batch. One of the new hires, Dan, was a former co-worker from the restaurant. We had worked together at the host stand, so I was glad to see a familiar face. I went over to his desk, said hello, and asked why he left the restaurant. He hadn't left willingly. He had been laid off because the company was under investigation. It had all started with a small matter. The corporate office received an email with a video attached, the one I had filmed from my pocket. That was enough for corporate to send someone to investigate. Dan was surprised I hadn't heard about it since there had been multiple attempts to reach me. As soon as he said that, I logged into my old email from when I first applied to the restaurant. I had dozens of emails asking me to come in and discuss my employment and termination. I never replied. I just didn't care anymore. I had also changed my number so they couldn't DDDTMT contact me by phone. Dan explained that before corporate sent someone, Hank and Chuck tried to offer my department a small pay raise to tell corporate I was incompetent and failed to do my job. The day the corporate auditor, let VDJTMs call her Linda, showed up, there was a small exodus from my department. They quit on the spot in front of Linda and made sure to expose Hank and Chuck before leaving. Strike one for them. Strike two came a couple of days after Linda showed Hank and Chuck the recording. They denied everything, but there was no mistaking Hank's voice. It was unique. The video also picked up our voices when we shook hands and had a friendly goodbye, something they bragged about to Linda, thinking it made them look good. This was NVJTMTT, the actual strike two. That came when it was clear they needed to be separated. So Linda sent Chuck to another restaurant owned by the company and temporarily demoted Hank to manager. This split them up. They had been an inseparable team, but the pressure of the investigation pushed them over the edge. They started fighting on Facebook, on the company's page. The post was deleted, but Dan described it like this. Chuck was in a Facebook post on the restaurant page, and Hank made a snarky comment about how Chuck shouldn't DJJTMT be in the picture since he had been moved for misconduct. Chuck saw it and replied with something like, "At least when people Google me, they don't find out I punched my wife," to which Hank responded, "Funny coming from the guy cheating on his wife with Janet VTM's sister." Not her real name, but Janet was the girl they put in charge of my old department after they fired me. Chuck replied, "Like you haven't tried to sleep with half the waitresses. They all have stories about you." The post was deleted, but not before Linda saw it. That was strike two. Strike three came the next day when Linda interviewed the female staff to see if any of them could confirm Hank made moves on them. All the girls were interviewed separately, and several had similar stories. Each one said Hank offered to be their sugar daddy if they sent nudes or stayed after closing to fool around. Hank was fired, but that wasn't VJTM the worst of it. Linda was in VJTM'd just anyone from corporate. She used to be the regional manager for the area and had hired Hank VJTM's wife as the general manager of another restaurant in the city. She called up Hank VJTM's wife and told her everything she had learned from the waitstaff. We later found out they got divorced over it. She had already given him a second chance after he beat her. I don't know why she gave him another chance after that, but she sure didn't give him a third. After firing Hank, Linda interviewed the line cook who had given me the food. During the interview, he accidentally revealed he was an illegal immigrant. Linda had his file, which included an Illinois ID and social security number, so she pressed him for more information. It turned out that Chuck had some shady connections and had a mini black market operation where he got fake social security cards and IDs for the illegal immigrants he hired at reduced wages. This had been going on for at least 4 years. Needless to say, this was a felony. Faced with a potential PR nightmare, Linda felt she had no choice but to alert the authorities. The local police enlisted the help of the FBI since some evidence went beyond their jurisdiction. Chuck was arrested and quickly ratted out the people he had sold Social Security cards and IDs to. He gave up about 14 names, and by the time Dan was let go, at least half had been deported. One of those deported was the line cook who had given me the food the day I was fired. Dan explained that all this started with my firing, but I never sent the recording to corporate. I had only sent it to Bob when he hired me. I asked Bob about it, and he told me he had sent it to his wife since she was a lawyer. He wanted to see if I had a case to sue my old job since what they did was wrong, but he also remembered that I had said, "I'm not the type to make millions off a company because of 2 jerks, but it would be sweet to see them lose their jobs." So, His wife was the one who sent it to the legal team at corporate HQ. Bob showed it to his wife, who then forwarded it to the big shots at my old job. They were just trying to get 2 scumbags fired for what they did to me, but ended up pulling a thread so long it didn't VDJTMT stop until there were sexual harassment accusations, cheating scandals, a divorce, mass layoffs, pending investigations, a staff overhaul, an FBI probe into black market dealings of fake documents, and at least 6 deportations, possibly as many as 14. I don't VDDTMT know if this counts as nuclear revenge since I didn't actively pursue it, but Dan showed me that even if it was NVJ-TMT revenge, it was definitely nuclear, and the crater left was massive. Bob's wife had really stirred things up. Turns out the corporate folks took the video seriously. They sent Linda, who had history with Hank's wife, to dig into the mess. Hank's wife, Karen, was a real piece of work. She didn't hesitate to make everything harder for Hank. She was the one who had given him a second chance after he hit her, but now she acted all high and mighty, as if she had never seen it coming again. When Linda told her about Hank VDJTMA's antics with the waitresses, Karen blew up. Not only did she file for divorce, but she also dragged Hank VJTM's name through the mud publicly. Back at the restaurant, the fallout was huge. After Chuck got arrested, Linda kept digging. She found out that Chuck had been skimming off the books, too. He had set up a system where he pocketed extra cash from the illegal workers' reduced wages. It was NVDJ-TUEMT just about fake IDs and social security numbers anymore. It was straight-up theft. Linda handed everything over to the FBI. They were more than happy to take it from there. The day Chuck got hauled away, there was a sense of chaos. The staff was either too scared to speak up or too angry to stay silent. A few more people quit on the spot. Dan told me that the vibe at the place turned toxic. No one trusted anyone, and everyone was watching their backs. The higher-ups at corporate decided to do a full sweep of the restaurant. They started interviewing everyone, and the stories that came out were wild. One of the new girls, Lisa, told Linda that Chuck had tried to hit on her, too. He had promised her better shifts if she VDJNG cooperated. DAKJ. Another guy, Mike, said Chuck made him do his dirty work, like handling the cash from the illegal deals. Linda was like a shark smelling blood. She pushed harder and more dirt came out. Turns out Hank wasn't VG2M just trying to sleep with the waitresses. He had also been harassing some of the guys. It was a nightmare. Then came the hammer. Linda found out that some of the deported workers had been involved in other shady activities, all tied back to Chuck and Hank VJRTMM's mismanagement. This was NVJMT just a case of a few bad hires. It was a criminal network. The FBI started linking the dots, and it got worse. They found out that Chuck VDJ-TM's fake ID business had ties to a larger ring operating across multiple states. By now, Karen was having a field day. She went to the media, airing all the dirty laundry. She made sure everyone knew what a monster Hank was. She wasn't just kicking him when he was down, she was burying him. She gave interviews, showed up on local news, and even wrote a scathing op-ed in the city paper. It was brutal. Hank's reputation was in tatters, and there was no coming back from that. The corporate office decided to clean house entirely. They brought in a whole new management team, fired anyone remotely connected to Hank and Chuck, and started over. They even changed the restaurant's name, trying to distance themselves from the scandal. It was a total reboot. So Karen wasn't just content with ruining Hank's career. She went for the jugular. She filed for everything in the divorce, the house, the cars, even his retirement savings. Hank didn't stand a chance. She painted him as a monster, and honestly, he was. But she made sure everyone saw him as the villain in her sob story. She even went after his family, dragging them through the mud for supporting him. The whole thing was a spectacle. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, things were falling apart. The new management tried to pick up the pieces, but the damage was done. They were dealing with a staff that had been through hell and back. Morale was at an all-time low. People were scared to talk, scared to trust anyone. Linda was still around, making sure every corner was clean, but the mess left by Hank and Chuck was too big to fix overnight. Linda started implementing new policies to prevent this kind of disaster from happening again. She made sure everyone knew that harassment and illegal activities wouldn't be tolerated. She set up an anonymous tip line and held regular meetings to ensure everyone felt safe. But it was clear to everyone that it was more about saving the company's face than actually caring about the employees. One day Dan told me that Karen had shown up at the restaurant. She walked in like she owned the place, making a scene and demanding to see Hank. Of course he wasn't there, but she didn't care. She just wanted to make a point. She told everyone who would listen how she had taken him down and how she was going to make sure he never worked in the industry again. It was like watching a train wreck. You couldn't look away. The new managers tried to calm her down, but she wasn't having it. She went on and on about how she had sacrificed so much for him, how she had been the perfect wife, and how he had thrown it all away. It was a show, and she loved every minute of it. The staff just watched, some with pity, others with disgust. When she finally left, it felt like a storm had passed through. Karen's outburst was the final nail in the coffin for the old management team. The new managers decided to distance themselves even more from the past. They started fresh, hiring new staff, changing procedures, and even remodeling the place. It was like they were trying to erase any trace of Hank and Chuck. But for those who had been there, the scars remained. Dan and I kept in touch. He was doing well at the new job, and so was I. We often talked about how crazy things had gotten and how glad we were to be out of that mess. One day he mentioned that Linda had been promoted. She had done such a good job cleaning up the restaurant that corporate gave her a higher position. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things. But the story doesn't end there. The fallout from Hank and Chuck's misdeeds continued to ripple through the community. The FBI's investigation into the fake ID ring led to more arrests, and the scandal made headlines for months. People couldn't believe the extent of the corruption that had been happening right under their noses. It was a lesson in how a few bad apples could spoil the whole bunch. The fallout from Hank and Chuck's actions kept rippling out, and it was like a bad dream that wouldn't end. The FBI kept digging, uncovering more layers to the mess. They found out that Chuck had been part of a larger ring, and it wasn't just about fake IDs anymore, it was human trafficking. The news hit the community hard. Nobody could believe that something so sinister had been going on right under their noses. Meanwhile, Karen was still on her rampage. She showed up on TV talk shows crying about how Hank had ruined her life. She milked every bit of sympathy she could get, playing the victim to the hilt. But those of us who knew the truth saw right through her act. She wasn't just a woman scorned. She was a viper, using the situation to her advantage. She didn't care about the people who had been hurt, just about how she could benefit from their misery. At the restaurant, the new team was doing their best to rebuild. They hired a new head chef, brought in fresh staff, and tried to create a new culture. They held team-building exercises, training sessions, and even therapy sessions for the staff who had been traumatized by Hank and Chuck's regime. It was a long road to recovery, but they were committed. Dan and I watched from the sidelines, grateful to be out of there but still feeling the echoes of the chaos. One day, Dan called me with some big news. He had heard from a former coworker that Linda had been promoted again. She was now in charge of overseeing multiple restaurants in the region, thanks to her work in cleaning up our old place. It was a testament to how effective she had been, but it also reminded us of how deep the problems had gone. Karen wasn't done with her revenge tour. She took Hank to court, suing him for everything she could think of. She won a huge settlement, taking almost everything he had. Hank was left with nothing, a broken man who had lost his job, his wife, and his reputation. Karen made sure everyone knew about it too, plastering her victory all over social media. She reveled in his downfall, showing no mercy. Back in our new jobs, Dan and I thrived. The logistics company appreciated hard work and honesty, and we found a place where we could grow. But the shadow of what happened still lingered. We often talked about the irony of how Hank and Chuck's greed and corruption had led to their own destruction. It was a twisted kind of justice. One evening, Dan and I met up for drinks. We reminisced about the old days, shaking our heads at how crazy things had been. We toasted to surviving the madness and moving on to better things. As the night went on, we couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Despite everything, we had come out stronger, wiser, and with a story that was hard to believe. The FBI's investigation wrapped up eventually, but the effects were felt for years. The restaurant chain had to rebrand, change policies, and work hard to regain the trust of the community. It was a lesson in how quickly things could spiral out of control and how important it was to have integrity. For me, it was a chapter of my life I was glad to close. I had learned a lot, seen the worst in people, but also experienced the power of resilience and justice. Life went on, but the story of Hank, Chuck, and Karen would always be a reminder of the chaos that can unfold when greed and deception take the wheel. A few months later, I got a call from an old friend still working at the restaurant. He told me the place had finally turned a corner. They were seeing new customers, and the staff seemed happier. The dark cloud Hank and Chuck had left behind was starting to lift. It was good to hear, but I knew I was never going back. One day, out of the blue, I got a message from Karen. She wanted to meet up. I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me. We met at a coffee shop. She looked different, still carrying herself with that same attitude, but there was a hint of desperation in her eyes. She started talking about how hard things had been for her since the divorce, how she missed the life she had before everything fell apart. "Look," she said, "I know Hank was a bastard, but he wasn't all bad. I just got caught up in the mess. You know how it is." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the same woman who had gone on TV to tear him apart. Now she was playing the victim again. "I don't know, Karen," I replied. "Seems like you did all right for yourself." She looked at me, eyes narrowing. "You think this is easy? Trying to rebuild everything? Everyone looks at me like I'm some kind of villain." She sighed dramatically. "I just want a fresh start." I left that meeting feeling like I had just been through another round with Hank and Chuck. Karen hadn't changed. She was still out for herself, still playing the angles. But it didn't matter to me anymore. I had moved on, found a better place, and learned some tough lessons along the way. In the end, the whole saga was a reminder of how far people will go to cover their own mistakes and how justice, while slow, eventually catches up. I found peace in knowing that I had stood my ground, even when things got ugly. And I found solace in my new life, far away from the chaos of the restaurant world. Life at the logistics company was steady and rewarding. Dan and I became close friends, bonded by our shared history. We often joked about writing a book one day, calling it From the Frying Pan to the FBI. It was a dark joke, but it helped us process everything we had been through. The restaurant eventually became a success story again, but it was a different place. The new management made sure of that. They honored the past but looked to the future, making it clear that they had learned from the mistakes that had been made. As for Karen, I heard she moved out of state, trying to start over. Whether she succeeded or not, I never found out. I didn't care to. My life had moved on, and she was just a part of a chapter I was glad to leave behind. So that's my story. It's not a fairy tale, but it's mine. It taught me the value of integrity, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the strength it takes to rebuild after everything falls apart. And most importantly, it taught me that no matter how bad things get, there's always a way forward. As long as you keep moving, keep pushing, and never let the bastards grind you down.